welcome to episode 187 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Nathan Smith,
Andrew Swafford,
Michael O'Malley.
And in today's episode, we will be talking about movies we saw this week in part one. And in part two, we will be joined by special guest Blake Williams to talk about Jackass 3D as part of our Tennessee Auteurs series, as well as just 3D technology in general, the Big Ears Festival, and his new film that is playing at Big Ears, which is titled Prototype. But for movies that we saw this week in part one, technically the movies that we saw this week were other Jackass movies, so we're gonna just talk about the Jackass series kind of as a whole in this part, because the discussion in part two with Blake is much more on kind of the theory, as well as kind of the format and concept of the 3D technology as it relates to that Jackass 3D as a movie. So we wanted to kind of talk about just the pure content of these movies, and
and boy is there content.
There's some content, yeah. It's as you'll probably discover, pretty quickly, there is a clear divide between two sides of this whole discussion. So I guess just a general overview before we start. The Jackass films, there are 3 of them that they came out in.
Well, technically 4.
Technically 4.
There's a lot. There's also like Jackass 2.5, and there's like a straight to DVD Evil Knievel tribute. Yeah. There's 3 we're going to talk about. There's 3 whole numbers.
Yeah, there's 3 that we're going to talk about.
EU crap.
The 3 that we're talking about came out in 2002, 2006, and 2010 respectively. And the general, what they're about is you have this company of men led by Johnny Knoxville who take part in various degrees of debauchery,
Jackassery.
They make themselves look like jackasses.
Yeah, they do. Over the course of generally like hour and a half long features. The films are generally fragmented. There's no clear plot or narrative or through line. It's just kind of segmented set pieces for, I guess, a phrase, where they're, doing various things, and it just kind of, jumps from each one over the course of the runtime. This is one that Nathan has talked about on a previous episode, and I'm sure he'll talk again in a few minutes. But Michael and Andrew, I wanted to kind of start with you all because you are the anti-Jackass camp.
We're the faction.
That's
us. Michael, let's start with you. What are your general feelings on Jackass?
I feel like I want to start with some positive because it's going to be mostly negative for me.
Give the people what they want.
Yeah, there are like moments in Jackass that are like beams of light that are like really great, and I'm gonna remember fondly for a long time. And most of these involve like the collision of like the Jackass crew with people who are not quite in the Jackass crew reacting to their stunts. So like there's a scene or a sequence in Jackass 1 where one of the guys shoves a toy car up his rectum and then goes to the doctor and gets an X-ray.
Ryan Dunn. Yeah.
Yes, and like I had a legitimate good time like with that sequence where the doctor describes that he has seen toy cars before but not there. And the X-ray technician who takes the X-ray negative off of the fluorescent lights or whatever gives like this really long reaction shot that's just great. Yes. And Bam's parents are also like consistently great in how they react to like the stunts imposing upon their like domesticity,
and for us relatable. too.
Yeah,
it's like there's a part where I don't even remember what stunt it was, but Bam's mom says, "Why would you do that?" And he says, "Because it was funny." She's like, "No, it isn't."
Fuck funny is her. That's what she said. And so that's a good segue into the fact that, like, in general, I did not find the antics very amusing at all. And I was like, this is like probably like a feature of the films, is that like I was made very uncomfortable and like grossed by a lot of this stuff. But then also like, and again, this is I guess a feature of it, like I felt like a lot of it is in bad taste, which sure, like there's like poop flying at the camera and stuff, but also like just the general attitude and worldview that's like essentially like materialist to the extreme. Like everything is about like getting some sort of sensory reaction out of people and like out of each other. And like after a while, like that's not so much endearing as it is like legitimately to me like unfun to experience this like incessant like guffawing at people's pain and discomfort.
Yeah. And we can get more into, you mentioned the word worldview. I think that there is kind of a worldview being espoused by the dudes here that we can get more into later. But I feel like it should not be a controversial statement to say that I think these movies are bad. But apparently it is. Like we've had a lot of interactions on Letterboxd with people who are just, you know, in disbelief that we would...
Disheartened and disappointed. I mean...
A lot of these people may listen to our podcast, so here we're going to go in depth on why we feel like these movies are not necessarily as cinematically redeeming as people have kind of reclaimed them as being. For me, you know, we live in a world where people look down upon you know, mansplaining and white-splaining. I feel like I'm being splained to a certain extent of like why these movies are actually this and actually that. Because I feel like I lived the culture of these movies in the mid-2000s, and I know what the people who watch them actually get out of them, and I don't want any part in that. This is going to be very hard to talk about these films without bringing in like personal history, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that here. We are young people. As people who listen to this podcast know, we have the Young Critics Watch Old Movies series. I was in middle school when these movies came out, in early high school, and my best friend in middle school in the first 2 years of high school was obsessed with these movies, and I never actually watched them with him from front to back, but he was kind of incessantly showing me clips. We were listening to the music that is featured in the soundtracks of these movies. Like when I hear songs like I'm Turning Japanese or All My Friends Are Dead, like this takes me, like warps me back to middle school in a very uncomfortable way. I have to like reckon with these very embarrassing parts of my life that I have now disowned, and to the point where this friend of mine and I would reenact or kind of make our own versions of Jackass type stunts and film them and put them on YouTube. And I don't even remember like what they're labeled as anymore. People can maybe like do some deep dive research and try and find me as a middle schooler on YouTube. It's there, like duct taping ourselves to trees and like running over stuff with go-karts. And it's just, I remember the person that I was in middle school and like just how much of a stupid shit I was. And people probably listen to this podcast and roll their eyes at me all the time of like being a very pretentious, like try hard intellectual. And that to a certain extent, that is a reaction to the kind of person I was at this era of my life. And I know that the crowd for these movies was not in it for the cinema. They were in it for the grossness and the fetishization of like stupidness and being obnoxious and getting on other people's nerves, and also like mockery and putting other people down and laughing at their suffering or their lack of perfection in societal standards or whatever. And while I watch these movies, I just feel incredibly grossed out and pained by what they are doing and what they are making me experience and relive. So that's my harsh take on the Jackass films.
Yeah, I can see why it is difficult to like to parse feelings, especially when it comes to who you were at, like, especially at like a middle school age. It's such an awkward awkward stage of just anybody's life. And yeah, I'm in the same at the same point. I'm in the same camp as you. I remember when these movies were coming out, and there was that breed of person that was very much drawn to these movies when they were coming out in the television shows. And I think as a I almost had like the opposite effect as you, because when I was younger, I kind of was I kind of raised my nose to them and dismissed them, because for some reason I didn't want to associate myself with that type of culture, which made it ever the more odd when I watched these movies, recently for this podcast, and I'm not sure what has directly changed. Maybe I just don't care that much, but there was something, and I have a giant roll your eyes, this is total bullshit theory on these movies that I was really like vibing with. But I don't know, there was something about the first movie came out in 2002, and that's a year after 9/11 happens. And for some reason I read especially that movie and the second movie especially as kind of these, I think America as a whole, when 9/11 happened, it kind of lost a little bit of its vulnerability. I mean, of course, it had elements of that after Vietnam and Korea, but I think 9/11 was a much more personal attack, just because it was on American soil, and it was something that seemed unfathomable up to that point. And so I think like in this post 9/11 world, I felt I kind of just felt like Jackass, and especially this first movie and the stunts that they were performing, and just this recklessness and this devoid of care, not necessarily just other people and their feelings, but also just their own physical beings. It was like they were just throwing themselves at whatever, because you had already been hit with this massive unfathomable national pain. And so now it was like, it was almost like, let's see how much more how much more we can take. It was like, let's continue to let's see how far we can push the limits of just our physicality. And so with the first movie, I felt like it just was this deeply direct response to kind of that. And the second movie I was really taken with, because it kind of got a little, it was much more personal, and I felt like there was these really cool moments between the characters. And I think that the cool moments that I'm reading, you Michael and Andrew, you all are probably reading them as very infantile and immature, and we can talk about that. And then the third movie, to me, I felt like was the weakest of the three of them. We talk about it a little bit in the second part, but I think that at this point, like the whole theory that I had about these movies kind of was wearing thin. It came out in 2010, and I think that and you can kind of feel that wear on the men while they're performing the stunts in that movie. You could feel the kind of finality and the sadness in it, especially when you take into account that Ryan Dunn dies in a car crash a year after this is released, and that really had an impact on all of them. But I don't know. I can understand. I guess that long rambling about the movie was me also saying I can understand that point of view. I don't know where my how I don't know if my, you know, there's no, I guess, correct way of you know, I think that both ways that we're seeing it is in a similar form, but in two different lights.
I'm interested in going back to your political connections with Jackass 1 because, like, I don't disagree with you, but also, like, I feel like that, and I mean, we don't have to like be like get into like, you know, the nitty-gritties of politics, but I feel like that the US's response to 9/11 is at least a decade of problematic cultural behavior. And so like, and I don't, you know, we don't need to like hash out the politics, but I think like it's interesting that like, so Johnny Knoxville and like this attitude of the Jackass films, like we were talking, and Andrew mentioned that something about his class about like the Southern attitude of like doing stupid stuff, while we also had like a very Southern president who like, you know, really resonated in the South, and the way that like that kind of like impervious but boyish masculinity like interacts with like the way that the nation saw itself. To me, like I think it's true that this is like emblematic of a certain element of our culture, but I don't I guess I don't see a lot of pathos in that. Like I was reading like what you were saying, what I see is that this is like these are elements of our nation, or even just of masculinity, if we want to form that I'm not like a huge fan of, like this idea that like men or masculinity is this constant like braying like hilarity at like just these like kind of nihilistic situations.
Yeah, and for context, Michael mentioned my class, and you know, I teach an American literature class this semester, and we started with a Southern Lit unit because I'm teaching in Tennessee. And one of the questions that I asked my students as a writing activity was, what does it mean to be Southern? And I was thinking about one particular student's response, because he said that for him, being Southern means being willing to do stupid stuff, like go on stunts with a four-wheeler and, you know, get into really dangerous situations. And I feel that that is very present in the ethos of Johnny Knoxville. Just kind of and this has probably had to do with my childhood upbringing as well, like being in a very rural part of the country, don't have a lot of things to do, like things to entertain kids aside from television and video games. So a big part of like growing up as a kid in the South is just like going outside and fucking around and, you know, putting yourself in dangerous situations.
Well, and I even lived in like the Memphis area, you know, not quite like the sticks, but we still found time to like roll each other down hills in 50-gallon drum barrels and things like that.
And I think that we were also talking about these films as existing as a sort of tissue between you know, you have the 90s America's Funniest Home Videos culture, and then the current, you know, post 2000 or like 2010 YouTube culture. We're currently living in a like post Logan Paul goes to Japan scandal right now, and I was definitely getting that vibe from the first film, which has many extended sequences in Japan, including like Johnny Knoxville walking behind Japanese citizens and like banging a gong to surprise them, and it feels very of a piece with the current internet prank culture that exists. And again, I don't see that pathos or that sadness or that humanity come through these Jackass films, and I think that the people who were watching them and admired them did not pick up on that either, and they kind of ran with the most troubling aspects of it. Sorry, Nathan, go.
I just think the thing is at the end of the day, like you said earlier, you said, you know, I knew who the people were who were watching these and they weren't watching them for cinema. I mean, how many things do we all collectively as a foursome enjoy that most people who go to the theater to watch them do not give a fuck about cinema? Like, I don't think that even really enters into the question here at all. Like whether the general audience for these things considers the cinematic qualities of them. That being said, I do think it is worth considering them just because of how strange it is that movies like these were released into multiplex theaters, that there are these disjointed fragmentary movies that you have the first one shot on mini DV tape. You have these strange moments where the camera, like in the scene where Johnny Knoxville and Ryan Dunn are riding the golf carts and they crash and flip over, like the camera like tumbles into the wet grass, and you have all these like this brief moment where there are all these water droplets kind of reflecting off of the camera. And like, that's to me is like very worth considering. That is just such a strange image, like to have just, you know, to go to the mall and see that is really astounding to me. And I also think that there is something to go to this question about Southernness. I took my senior year of undergrad, I took an American Studies class. We did a unit on Southern Studies, and we had this guest lecturer come in to kind of give us an intro to Southern Studies as a concept. And she talked about how kind of within the United States, the South as a place sort of functions as this wound, as this place whose identity is never resolved, that is always hurting or suffering in some way. And the rest of the country, whenever it screws up, can point to the South, who is always bleeding, who is always in pain, and say, well, like, at least we're not the South. And I feel like, you know, I mean, sure, it's not at all intentional, but I think that there's a way in which Johnny Knoxville's body in particularly becomes like the reenactment of that site of like this woundedness and just having to like stab yourself over and over again for no reason at all. But it just keeps happening. And I also think, just real quick before, I really agree, Zach, with a lot of the points that you made. And I think there's some kind of idea where after, 9/11 happens, like in our cultural narrative, the period after this is like this sort of kind of adolescent period. And I think for men in particular, adolescence is like the time in which we are confronted by our bodies. And I mean, obviously the guys in Jackass are not adolescents and are far past adolescence, even if they may mentally seem to and emotionally still seem to be there. But I think there is some way in which like this desire for adolescent boys to see this kind of dangerous stuff and then reenact it themselves. It's kind of like adolescence is in some ways sort of this laboratory of identity where we're sort of growing into our bodies. We're testing the limits of our bodies. We are being reminded that we do in fact have a body. And I feel like Jackass is just kind of like, I don't know, this crucible for that sort of testing and elasticity of the body. And one last thing, sorry, I have just had a lot of points getting stocked up 20 minutes of this. But for me, a lot of the kind of the pathos and the emotion and the sincerity, a lot of it may be a sort of retroactive reading, like reading it after Ryan Dunn's death. For me, there's a lot of similarities. I mean, most people who have been listening to the podcast for a while know probably that I really love Fast and Furious. And there are a number of sort of uncomfortable parallels between the two. I mean, they both have the stunt warnings. They both have, they're very masculine and have this focus on the male body. But there's also very much rooted in the sense of family. And even though these guys are doing these really mean pranks to each other, I also feel like it is grounded at the end of the day in this sense of kinship and friendship. That these guys, they test their friendship and then they keep going. And there are these just moments, like especially in the first movie, that are just heartbreaking to me now. Like the moment I mentioned earlier where Ryan Dunn flips the golf cart over and Johnny Knoxville says, "Ryan, you're such a terrible driver." Or in the Son of Jackass sequence at the very end of the movie where you see Ryan Dunn in this ridiculous old man makeup, like made to look older than he would ever actually live to be. And that stuff is, it's totally like, it's not there in the text itself. It's totally like me projecting upon it. But when I see it, it's just like deeply unsettling and adds this other layer to the movie for me. I'll stop monopolizing the mic, but I just really wanted to cut in and speak my piece.
I like get that in the abstract, but I think that like for me, this feels really abstract, like these ideas of like, the kind of pure cinema elements or like the kind of metatextual elements of it feel really that's a very distant, like it's like looking at a skyscraper from a distance, and then you get up to the skyscraper. Like from a distance, I'm like, oh, that looks really cool. And then I get up to it and I see like cigarette butts and refuse at the like in the alley behind the skyscraper. And I feel like one of the big things that's like distracting me from like those readings is just like I can't escape like who is doing these stunts. And I don't mean like specifically Johnny Knoxville, but like the fact that like these are like, men in their 20s and 30s, and the fact that they are doing this as opposed to like, the virtual non-existence of women in these movies or whatever, just kind of like, and the way that their behavior, which is like, I feel like in a lot of other contexts would raise big flags or like be viewed as like, intensely otherized. So like the obsessive like genitalia and like the genital like almost mutilation of it, or definitely self-mutilation, pushing fish hooks through your cheeks and having like poop and puke and piss and all that like thrown around, like these are things that like in other contexts are viewed as like extremely like off-putting in ways that like we would say are un-American, right? So like we see in like National Geographic, like look at these strange people from other countries who have these strange piercings, where and we see people like literally pierce themselves in these movies, and it's the veneer of it is not of how strange is this. The veneer to me is that boys will be boys, like that these are just guys joking around, haha, aren't guys dumb? And I guess I just couldn't get over that. This was all like the consistency of tone of like, we're just goofing around kind of stuff. Whereas like the behavior is so extreme that I feel like if these guys were anyone else, besides just like white dudes, this would be viewed as extremely like out there.
And there's also some, you mentioned the mid 2000s being like a very problematic time in America, that being reflected in the way that these white dudes kind of project their jokes onto other people. Zach, you were talking about this being a post 9/11 franchise. We got to talk about how at the end of the second one, there's an extended joke where somebody pretends to be a terrorist and dresses up in blackface and a big beard made out of pubes and pretends to blow up a
I think he's not. I think his face isn't technically darkened. I think he's just,
I think it is though. Maybe I'm misremembering that.
He's definitely got fake beard though.
Yeah, but playing up that cultural stereotype about all people from the Middle East are terrorists or all Muslims are terrorists. There's also the scene in the second one where like there is a legit like sexual violation of Bam's mother, where they kind of swap her husband out with another large man who like begins to grope her in the middle of the night, and the joke is like, ha ha ha, she didn't see that coming. Like it's just not funny in a very like intimate, personal way that was hard for me to get over. And maybe that's me being a 2018 like liberal snowflake, but for these movies to be,
I think it is me being a liberal snowflake, because like I like I was saying, like I get in the abstract what you guys are saying, but I can't get over this.
Yeah, and I can't revel in the like mindless, playful fun of it, because it is so much like tethering itself to things with real world
grounded in a reality.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think Michael, to your point about like other people doing this, I think to me one of the like most telling and important moments in any of the movies is in Jackass 2 when there is a John Waters cameo. I mean,
yeah. Let's talk about that.
A long tradition of the same kind of behavior in John Waters movies. Obviously, functioning within a different context and being more explicitly like the relationship between this kind of shock value and queerness and repression in society. So I feel like the fact that John Waters co-signs these movies to me is kind of telling. And I feel like there is a way in which there is something about these movies, like that you have this group of ostensibly straight guys with their dicks out constantly, that there is like something about that where it's like, they're doing this stupid shit, but at the same time, it is at the very least for me refreshing to see a group of men who are like 100% comfortable with their bodies and with each other's bodies. That that is like a type of masculine behavior that, you know, even if it may be couched in all of this other stuff that we can consider heinous or reprehensible, that is like I don't know, a different strain of masculinity, and I think something that still exists apart from dominant culture, even if there are other ways in which it's not, in which it is very much reinforcing certain more regrettable things.
I guess I may have different experiences than you, but I definitely remember a lot of nakedness in my middle school years.
Yeah.
Like I remember playing, like, I remember lots of games eventually escalated to the strip version of that game. You know, ping pong became strip ping pong and things like that. That, like, you know, we weren't shaving each other's pubes or whatever. But I think, like, there's a similar like the boyishness and the pervasiveness, and this only gets evoked once or maybe twice in the trilogy, but the pervasiveness of no homo, where, like, masculine culture requires you to be, like, deeply obsessed with each other's, like, private acts, you know, whether that's like scatological
distancing
or
yourself from the implication. Like Johnny Knoxville wears a shirt that says "totally straight" with like a rainbow font and a unicorn on it. It feels like a mid 2000s version of No Homo.
To me, seeing the shirt that said "totally straight" like didn't read necessarily as like a no homo. To me, it almost read more like a ironic kind of.
I think I would be willing to read the movies in the same way that you do, Nathan, like as a John Waters type revival, if I got the vibe that any of these guys were anywhere on the spectrum other than totally straight.
I definitely got a little bit of those vibes, though.
In a way, but like, I think that it's different when John Waters does this kind of like scatological transgressive stuff than when somebody who is, like you said, Nathan, ostensibly straight does it, kind of like representing this hegemony of like straightness, whiteness, maleness. They kind of get a pass to do all this boys will be boys stuff that, you know, John Waters was doing for like actual political transgressiveness. But here it's like just, absurdity. And it's kind of unquestioned in a way that John Waters wasn't necessarily. But I'm not an expert in John Waters, so I should probably not talk about his movies.
I don't want to assume anything about anyone's sexualities in here just because as much private stuff as I see of theirs, you still never know about people. And I also feel, I don't know, there's just like some, like, I don't know. I just see something in some of these guys like that is kind of charming, like Chris Pontius and Steve-O just like have a certain presence that I find just like is like very warm in some weird way.
No, I agree with you. The one moment I think of with Steve-O is in the third movie. I really liked Steve-O a lot. He was probably my favorite out of the entire group because, I
mean, how can you not love somebody who has a tattoo of their own face on their back?
Yeah, well, the moment of his that I loved was in the third movie, and the prank was Preston, who is the heavyset guy, had this suit that was gonna take his sweat as he goes on like a Stairmaster, and then Steve-O was gonna drink the sweat. And it was this deeply disgusting thing because you have this cup of sweat that is just coming from all over his body. And Steve-O, of course, just throws it down, begins immediately just vomiting everywhere. And you would think that he would, I don't know how else he would react, but his immediate reaction is just like, he kind of, goes to his friend and is like, yeah, it's like everything was fine. There was no animosity or anything toward, that would have ruptured the friendship. It was almost like this was work. Like no harm, no foul. This was work. Granted, it was drinking sweat, which was disgusting, but I don't know. I think that there is like this some degree of charm to these guys because maybe I'll step in the trap here, but I think that there's a degree of harmlessness to their actions.
This is sort of a point you made maybe 30 seconds ago or something like that, but like, do you think that these guys like are okay with each other by the end of the trilogy? Because like in the third movie, it seems a little strained to me, and like part of this seems to like physical, like their body, like they're 10 years older almost than like when they started the Jackass stuff, and their bodies are just. There's sequences where they seem to be legitimately injured in ways that they weren't in like the other ones. But then there's also sequences where they seem legitimately mad at each other in ways that they weren't either. And
they let the post-prank play out a lot longer in the third one.
Right, like there's the one, and I forget who it is, but like he gets pranked, and then at the end he's like, I'm so glad I'm leaving by 3. Maybe I'll call and get an earlier flight. And he like, it's not like everyone else is laughing, but he seems legitimately pissed at that moment. And there's like a few other moments like that.
I always wonder about Dave England, because throughout all the movies, he seems to be the one who's like having the least fun and always looks
I agree.
sad. Yeah. Maybe it's just like he serves some function as a baby face, just like he looks sad. So that's his function within the group. But I have always kind of wondered about him, like, how into this actually are you? But there is something about the moments where it does play out longer after, like in the second one too, when Bam and Johnny get shot, and Bam, you hear him say like, I just wanted to skateboard, I didn't want to get shot at. Where, I don't know, it's like something about those moments of realness when they cut through, as like deeply uncomfortable as they are, in the way that they offset everything else. Like I feel like they have a certain value. I don't know, good or bad.
Yeah, well, I think that it you know, to really reach back, I think that a lot of the stunts and kind of the reaction to what happens kind of goes back to vaudevillian days. And you know, you think of some of the stunts that somebody like Buster Keaton performs,
and you have a literal allusion to Buster Keaton in the second one.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, I'm thinking about the one stunt that Buster Keaton does in Sherlock Jr., where he's pulling on the water spigot thing and then falls. And in real life, he injured his back, and it never really healed correctly. But there's something about that, again, goes back to the charm of, much like somebody like Keaton, where these guys in the Jackass movies just roll with the pain, like they get hit with this insurmountable amount of pain and misery, but I think they do play it off to an extent, and that's what's so strange. Going back to Michael's point about the third movie, because I think there is some wear on it. I think that they are getting tired, and I think that they are probably getting tired of each other to an extent. And there's something that's kind of human about that. Like I guess I wasn't necessarily, I was sad, but I also wasn't sad, because I think that that's just natural. Like after a while, we talked about this at the beginning of this section of the podcast, where there's a part of you that after a while you probably get tired of, and you kind of work your way out of. And so maybe that's what this third movie is compared to the other two. Right.
I appreciated seeing them to a certain extent grow out of it in the third episode, and even though that leads to the stunts maybe being not as extreme or not as ambitious, there was a little bit more humanity in that last section. But for the vast majority of all three of these movies, I watch them and don't see that charmingness that you, Zach and Nathan, do, because I see myself and the person that I decided not to be, and can't imagine being as a grown man. And I look at somebody like Johnny Knoxville as like somebody who never grew out of that, and it's like reprehensible to a certain extent to me, and I can't get over that.
That sounds like a personal problem. That sounds like something you need to work out on your own.
But I don't think it's just me. Like, I think that if I ran into a person like Johnny Knoxville in the street, no matter who I was, and you see that with the public bystanders of these movies, like they want nothing to do with him. He's a menace, and I don't mean to sound like an old man like yelling on his front porch or anything, but there's a reason why we teach teenage boys to grow out of this bullshit, because we need a functioning society.
I wonder,
maybe then we can find a sort of value in Jackass, because it seems like Jackass helped you grow out of that shit.
But it also,
straight.
It also reflects a type of extension of adolescence that happens with like the millennial generation, and
you read like 19th century literary criticism, Love and Death in the American Novel. That shit's all old. The American man-child thing going way back.
Okay, yeah. But like you can't deny the one-to-one correlation of what's going on in Jackass and like these obnoxious personas and what we see in YouTube prank culture and the Logan Paul bullshit. Like, don't say that this is a net positive for society. I really don't see that.
I know. But I will say, I do think, though, there is, you've mentioned some of the negative things that have come out of Jackass, but I do think there are some legitimate positives. Like, I think you look at something like the Eric Andre show, which is seems to me pretty clearly inspired by Jackass, and also probably by the Tom Green show. But the fact that you have men of color like going out doing these kind of pranks, I feel like adds a layer of maybe more legitimate transgressiveness to it. So I do think there maybe has been a positive, some positive descendants of Jackass, and not just Logan Paul. Although I will say that I saw some clips of Logan Paul in Japan, and I was also reminded of the first movie, as much as I may enjoy these things. So
I wonder if also, to bring in another kind of thing that's maybe just like our problem, but like both Andrew and I are high school teachers, and so like we are constantly confronted with like, I guess like just adolescence in general, which is like often very charming and interesting, and I enjoy being around, but also like we also like have to deal a lot with like the more like troubling aspects of people being immature and kind of not quite regarding each other with empathy, and like valuing laughs over like someone else's comfort and things like that kind of, in a way, like I can imagine if I were in if I didn't see that a lot on a day-to-day level, I could view that as like that's part of my past that I've moved beyond, whereas like on a professional level I have to deal with it, and so like this isn't quite like I grew out of it, and so therefore like I don't have to, that's the end and I've matured. It's like I see other people who are influenced by culture like this, and it troubles me. Right.
I see the scene at the beginning of the first one where Johnny Knoxville is arguing with the rental car people of like, I'm not paying for this, you're going to pay for this. I'm not going to pay for this, you're going to pay for this. And I think about the kind of conversations we have with our students where you try to insist to them like, you cannot act like this with adults in the real world. And Johnny Knoxville's like, yes, you can, ha ha ha. And it does seem to be a sort of permissive gesture to like allow teenage boys to like continue to be their worst selves as long as they want.
Well,
it got very quiet.
We've ran it. It's been a while, so we're gonna have to wrap it up. Does anybody have any last real quick thoughts before we close this part?
I think it's amazing that a movie exists in which John Waters, Juicy J, and Tony Hawk are all together. Even if they may not literally be together in the same scene, they are united.
And 3 6 Mafia, if we want to tie this into a future Tennessee Auteurs movie.
Hustle and Flow, it's coming.
Juicy J did not win his Oscar for Jackass 2, but he should have.
We will be back talking about Jackass some more, but a little bit more, I would say, I don't know, it's about the same as this, really.
It's not really that much about Jackass.
Yeah, but we're going to be talking with Blake Williams about 3D filmmaking and a lot of other stuff, so please stick around for the second part.
Hi there, there, Cinematary listeners. This is your favorite Filipino podcaster, Jessica Carr, with an important message during this break in the show. Cinematary would like you to know that we surprisingly do not want your money, and we don't want to place ads in the show at this time. That's not why we do this. We do it because we enjoy each other's company, and we want to bring you our pure, unadulterated opinions on the world of cinema. However, there are a few things you can do to help out the show that we would greatly appreciate. Firstly, leave us a review on iTunes, preferably a positive one, because apparently this will help increase our podcast exposure. Secondly, send us a tweet at Cinematary, or better yet, send us an email at cinematary@yahoo.com so we can hear from you guys for a change. Maybe you can tell us where the money from Fargo is stashed, or maybe you don't think In the Mood for Love is the sexiest movie you've ever seen. Regardless, let us know your thoughts and we will read them out and respond to them on future episodes. Finally, please share the show with friends and members of your family who you think really enjoy listening to us and participating in our film discussions. We also have some cool merchandise that you can check out on the site. So to recap, review, send us your thoughts through Twitter and email, and share with your friends and family. We would truly appreciate it. Thank you for listening, and now back to the show.
We are back with part 2 of episode 187 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Tennessee Auteurs series with 2010's Jackass 3D. But before that, I want to welcome our very special guest, Mr. Blake Williams. He's going to come on and talk with us a little bit about 3D filmmaking, his own film that he is showing at Big Ears, as well as just kind of that festival at large. Blake, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So I guess real briefly before we get into the kind of discussion on the film, do you mind kind of talking about your involvement with Big Ears? I'm sure we'll cover that a lot later in this portion, but just kind of give a brief overview of your connection to that festival.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been friends with Darren Hughes for a number of years from his attendance at the Toronto International Film Festival, and I live in Toronto, and I think this is the third year that they've been doing the film portion of the Big Ears Festival, and I went for the first time last year and had an amazing time with the programming there. And after he found out I made this 3D feature, he basically just asked me to be a guest programmer for this year and just to curate a selection of 3D movies and like a few short programs, some features, and so yeah, I agreed. And so for the last 3 or 4 months, we've been vigorously trying to put a program together, and it's finally shaping up. We actually finally approved our final film this afternoon.
And Jackass 3D was one of those films on that list. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what the other 3D features playing at Big Ears are?
Yeah, we have a couple from New York-based avant-garde icon Ken Jacobs. He's been basically working in different modes of stereo filmmaking and image making since, I don't know, at least the 1960s, so like more than 50 years now. And so we're going to show a couple of his recent projects. One is very political work that he made during the Occupy movement called Seeking the Monkey King. And then we're going to show something he made last year with another 3D experimental image group called Open-Ended Group called Ulysses in the Subway, which is a project that visualizes an audio recording that's Ken and his partner Flo Jacobs did while they were riding through the New York subway system. And then beyond that, it'll be a bit more I guess a couple of mainstream. I mean, we had a couple of mainstream projects. We had the Jackass film, obviously, but also going back a little bit deeper into history, we're showing Alfred Hitchcock's one 3D movie that he made in 1954, Dial M for Murder, which actually upon its release it showed at its world premiere in 3D, but the reaction to it was so negative that its general release was only in 2D, and so it had a very limited theatrical 3D rollout, and so it had a re-release a few years ago when they did the restoration that was coming out with the Blu-ray, but it's a very difficult film to see in 3D, and so we're happy to show that as a kind of teen-80s Hollywood 3D wave that lasted about 2 years. We're going to show Herzog's Cave movie, Dreams from 2010, Goodbye to Language, one of the most experimental 3D films ever made from 2014, and maybe one or two others that I can't think of off the top of my head, but and then my movie.
Just that little one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel like we'll probably circle back to, especially your movie. We're going to kind of work that in. But I wanted to first start off, with the topic of this episode, which is Jackass 3D, and we've covered the film's kind of content wise up to this point. And so with you, I wanted to kind of talk about the use of this technology for this film, because I feel like with 3D, for the most part, in terms of mainstream films, it kind of seems almost like a cash grab for studios. They, it's not like they. Unless it's somebody like James Cameron or Christopher Nolan, it's not really like somebody's, filming the movie with 3D in mind. It's kind of a post-production thing. So in the case of Jackass 3D, did you find that it's a movie that's kind of trying to do stuff with the form, do stuff with the technology, or was it just kind of a cash grab? Because it was the third movie, they could make it 3D, and that's easy.
Right. Yeah, I mean it's probably a little of both. I mean it is part of what a couple of scholars have written about it as this phenomenon of having the third entry in a film franchise being like the 3D one, like Step Up 3D and
Spy Kids 3D,
Jaws 3D,
the Amityville 3D, 13 3D, and it is this kind of playing into this franchise connoisseurship that you get from rewarding people who have seen all of the entries in a specific franchise by basically giving them the favorite iconic stylistic flourishes from the franchise, but in an exaggerated way that kind of rewards their repeated engagement with the series. So in that sense, I do think there is a certain commercial value that they're playing into that. But I mean, it's also Jackass 3D, so it's kind of making fun of that at the same time by throwing excrement and sewage and piss and shit and all sorts of things in your face and basically making you feel like you're going to pass out. And so it's something that it's a film that I teach in my 3D class as we begin to start talking about viscera and visceral filmmaking, which kind of leads us into discussions about more like tactile ways of engaging with the cinematic image, because making certain decisions that are, it's playing with pranks and certain images of a type of masculinity, but at the same time, it's also playing with issues of the body and directly engaging with the kind of refuse of the human body and have people's body and the things that are inside their bodies and their, with their urine and with their feces and sewage and vomit and all these things. It's playing with the surface of the image in a way that's very unique and also kind of almost an epitome of a certain way of thinking about 3D filmmaking. So
you had an interview in CinemaScope, and I think you say something that kind of I think maybe connects to what you're saying now about and I had to look up this term, the haptic visuality, which I'm kind of gleaning is sort of disrupting the distance between viewer and the screen, where you were talking about 3D brings them into the content of the film. Talking about, the effect is not so much on the screen. This is your quote. It becomes like in the glasses and in your own head. And you talked about, it throwing like, excrement at the audience. Like, how do you feel like is what Jackass 3D is doing, like, by using the kind of like transgressive, like viscera, like you said, does that make this like a fundamentally different 3D experience than like, say, like, I don't know, like Avatar in 3D, or, how does that collapsing of distance affect how people view Jackass versus like other 3D movies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question. I don't know if I answer. I mean, when I'm talking about like the haptic visuality, I'm pulling from like from certain like scholars, like specifically a writer named Laura Marks, who is writing about the difference between a kind of optical visuality, like when you're looking at a film at a film image, you are kind of gazing at a space in a somewhat voyeuristic way. Like there's a kind of remove where you have your position and you're looking at the screen and you're looking at bodies who are moving in a space and kind of observing how they occupy that space. But then with this more haptic style of visuality, you often get from like close up, it's less about looking at something from a remove, but it's more about feeling as though you're almost in contact with it, or like you can touch it, like you can touch the of the film with your eyes in a way, and like you can feel the texture of the screen and of the bodies on screen, and in a way the film itself starts to become synonymous with the body, and you start to feel like regardless of the fact that there may be a human subject on screen, like the film itself starts to seem so it has a skin, and it takes on this kind of form. And so when we're talking about with 3D ness in this context, it's kind of just thinking about this body as I guess just having more of a volume and having more of a character, and it starts to have kind of like an attitude. And the thing with something like Jackass 3D, which when I'm teaching it, I'm always using it as a kind of pairing with talking about 3D pornography. It's a lot about having to do with projectiles and things that are coming out of the screen at you, fluids that are coming out of the screen. And my favorite moment in Jackass 3D, or at least the one that I find the easiest to kind of talk about the 3D-ness as being an essential part of the movie, is the part where I can't remember which guy it is, but when he puts the camera next to his penis and starts peeing on everybody.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's kind of like this inversion of the moment in like Gaspar Noé's Love 3D, or in some of the 60s and 70s 3D films where they're having cum shots that come out of the screen and seem as if they're going to land on your face. It's kind of an inversion where you're actually kind of projecting into the screen in this moment, but in a similar way.
This is going to sound like a weird comment to make after talking about the urinating on stranger sequence. But, all of us on the Cinemaker Chair team, of course, watched this movie in 2D because we were not at Big Ears when we watched it. And we're looking forward to going to Big Ears and rewatching it there. But one thing that Michael and I were talking about is how Jackass 3 almost feels toned down in a way in terms of the kinds of stunts and the amount of pain that you're feeling when compared to Jackass number 2. Do you feel like, and I feel like I know the answer to this, but is it the lack of pain and the lack of extremity, is that offset by the visual quality that the 3D brings to the film? Like, what do you think this movie gains from the 3D projection, or does it even work in 2D?
Well, I haven't actually seen it in. First of all, I haven't actually seen it in 2D, but I also haven't seen it in proper 3D, because I've only seen it in my classroom with my students, where we don't have an actual 3D projector, so I have to show it in an anaglyph version. So I converted it into the like the old school red-blue type of 3D. Okay. And so, I mean, you still get the 3D effects, but it's not like the full color version. But it's a number of my students always point out how the film at least in comparison to the other movies that we're watching in the class, feels like the most two-dimensional of the films that we watch. And I think there are actually a number of stunts in the movie that were shot without a 3D camera. And one thing, it could be something to do with budget, or it could be something to do with practicality of having a 3D camera in certain scenes. But it also, I think, I find makes the moments where it cuts to a new sequence that is actually in 3D, I think, more affecting, because there's always this kind of 3D, I don't know if it's fatigue is the right word, but a kind of complacency or something where you're watching a 3D movie and after a while the 3D-ness kind of goes away because you become used to it, in the same way that, like, when you're looking at the world with your own eyes in 3D, you're not really cognizant of the fact that there's depth, like an extreme amount of depth in every moment of your vision, and so you kind of adapt to it. And there's a novelty to the 3D image of when you first see it, and the effect of having certain objects coming closer to you or certain things going into the screen space that kind of becomes normalized as you're with it for 15-20 minutes. But when you go back and forth from these different sequences, it is kind of it's always reinstating and refreshing that moment of the novelty of it for your eyes, and so it doesn't really ever go away or wear down. But it's been so long since I've seen the other Jackass films that I don't really remember certain structural things. But I mean, one of the things about Jackass 3D is that it opens and closes with these very long, very produced sequences of like super slow motion, like set explosions and with, it seems like most of the budget, like probably 80% of the budget was spent on these opening and closing and that's where most of the 3D really is, and having all these particles flying all over the room, and you can really feel the depth of that image, which is funny because I think a lot of the appeal of a movie like Jackass being in 3D, like when you first hear about it, is the idea of all the all the puke and all the more disgusting bits of the movie, those aspects being in 3D. And while they are there, and I think some of them are actually very satisfying, most notably the porta potty bungee jump, it does seem like a lot of it is kind of maybe not taking the most advantage of the 3D, but I find that when it actually is using it, it's doing it really well, and it's doing it in a way it's still kind of hokey and dumb in a way that you would hope a Jackass film to be, like having the cameraman vomit, as a cameraman always has to vomit during a Jackass show or movie, but of course he has to vomit into the camera, onto his camera. He can't vomit to the side, he has to vomit into his camera, so you feel like you're getting vomited on, I guess, with the 3D aspect. But yeah.
This might be a kind of a broader question than just the Jackass movie, but is there a kind of a misconception that people have about this technology that you always like to clarify? Like, as somebody who studies it pretty intently, is there something that the average moviegoer who just kind of sees it like a gimmick or a addition to an attraction maybe are missing?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is always the biggest hump to get over with my students is that it's a purely visual component of the movie, and one of the problems that visual formats always have when they're being introduced to the mainstream is that you have to be able to justify that this is beneficial to the narrative. And so that's something that I talk about in my very first classes when we're and I compare the introduction of 3D to the introduction of color cinema, and the fact that you always have this when you're introducing a new form, whether it's color or 3D or widescreen cinema, you have to there's always this kind of wave at the beginning where the format is kind of demonstrating what it can do and trying to assert what it can do and justify its necessity by exaggerating every stroke. And the color in early colors is extremely vibrant, like distractingly vibrant, and the are redder than any reds you've ever seen, and the blues and the greens. And then there's always this kind of backlash period where that it's distracting from the narrative, suffering because of this visual format, and so then kind of enter this moment where it becomes more subdued and very restrained. And then there's always a compromised mode that kind of takes over. That's where it reasserts itself and its vibrancy, but it asserts itself as kind of able to be accommodated and accommodating to narrative, because ultimately the institution of cinema, at least for the last 100 years, has been geared towards narrative and storytelling. And so if you can't serve that, then you end up being kind of stigmatized and deemed a gimmick. And I think 3D, more than any of the other formats, has struggled to overcome that, and that's why it's always kind of gone away for certain periods of time. Mm-hmm. And you know, when it comes, it's very exciting and feels new, but I think I think we've done the best job so far this time, and which is why it's kind of stayed around more than 3 years. But but it's always difficult to kind of talk about 3D as a way that's not just talking about, did the movie in 3D? Just because when you go to watch a movie in color nowadays, you know, it's just kind of understood as being in color. Like, you don't watch a movie and think, oh, well, did that really need to be in color? Mm-hmm. Like, it could have been white. Like, you wouldn't do that just because it's kind of a fact that movies are in color now. You know, there's no real reason why films wouldn't need to be the same way. Like, where a film is just kind of understood as being 3D as opposed to one it's in 3D and it has to justify itself and its 3D-ness. Right. It doesn't do a good job of just superfluous and has done a bad job, and you can be critical of it for that. And so, I don't know. It's like it's just a way of kind of getting beyond the idea that there needs to be a kind of justification of the films that accommodates the narrative, where I prefer to think of it the other way around, that the movie's content needs to kind of justify itself.
On the point you were making a minute ago about 3D constantly falling out of fashion, this is something that gets brought up in your CinemaScope interview as well. You talk about how you think the 3D medium is a perpetual infant, you say, and because it's always trying to kind of be reborn and make itself new. And you talk about how, because people are trying to justify the use of 3D, it ends up being a form of play and a kind of a childlike play. Do you feel like that is particularly relevant in the context of Jackass, where you have, you know, I don't think it's controversial to say immature actors and producers making this movie. Is that part of the appeal? Like, is this a perfect mode for this kind of man-child to play around in with all of their own excreta, all that stuff?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's I think in many ways it's kind of one of the, you know, the emblematic 3D films ever made for that very reason. The fact that it is this, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily a fundamental component of 3D filmmaking as much as it is just kind of a matter of circumstance, and the fact that it's, unlike color, as I was mentioning earlier, it never really became standardized and was able to mature and become integrated into the standard operating procedures of cinema and institutional cinema. And so every time it comes around, whether it be in the 50s or in the 80s or here again in the last 10 years, it's always being reborn. And so it's always young, and it's always having to learn a language. It's always kind of learning how it needs to behave, which is, you know, just like how a little kid acts, and they don't really understand the morals of how the world works, and so it has to just do its own thing until it figures out how to behave in a way that doesn't call attention to itself. And that's kind of the nice thing, I think, about 3D, is that it's always noticed, it's always there, but at the same time it's also ends up being a drawback, just because of this problem, like I was mentioning, that it has to justify itself, and it needs to accommodate a narrative. But yeah, with and I guess it's kind of an irony of the way it's used in Jackass, because it is a little bit subdued, with the exception of certain moments where it becomes really the opposite of subdued.
If I can maybe turn this around on you, like, so you've made a few 3D films at this point. Do you feel like when you approach 3D, is there like a language that you've grasped, or is each film kind of like, do you feel like reinventing or going back to that infant stage of 3D?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would be the right person to answer that question, actually. But I mean, I made 4 short films that were in 3D, and then I just finished my first feature, and so each one does a different thing. Each one uses the 3D in a different way. And that has a lot to do with the fact that just in general, whether I'm working in 3D or not, I never like to repeat myself. And I don't really like to repeat certain visual strategies from film to film. And so just in that sense, each film is made as a process of kind of discovering how something works, or how certain images work together and work in response to the 3D strategy that I'm using in a given film. And so it's in that sense, they're more kind of, each film is kind of a thought process of thinking through a certain strategy of trying to make sense of the theme of the film in conjunction with the visual strategy. And so I guess in that sense, there's a certain immaturity to the sensation that you might get from it. Not immature in the sense that the making of it is from an immature sensibility, but just like a kind of lack of self-awareness. Like it's a film it's films that are always, at least, and this is something that I hope that they achieve, films that are kind of trying to figure themselves out before your eyes, like you're kind of thinking along with the film. At least that's kind of the intent. And so I guess in that sense, you might equate that with a kind of youthfulness. It's possible.
I wanted to ask, what is the experience of teaching 3D like? Just because I think it's interesting that you're approaching it both as a film artist and in a more academic context. And I myself have never had the pleasure of viewing a 3D film in a classroom setting. I imagine that brings certain considerations of image and form that aren't really present with 2D film.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the unfortunate things is that I'm at a pretty good university institution, and but they don't have much faith in 3D or new media technologies at all, and so they don't have like 3D projection on campus anywhere. And so I have to, like I mentioned, the fact that I always have to show Jackass in the anaglyph red-blue format of 3D. That's how I have to show all the films in the class. And so there's always because that's kind of a flawed format for 3D viewing, and so there's always this complaint that I get from the students about how they certain parts didn't work, or it seemed to give them, a headache, perhaps more than a 3D movie would. But beside that, the nice thing about the class is that 3D as a topic is generally pretty exciting, I think, to late teens, early 20-something students. And so the class always fills up really quickly, like more quickly than most of the other classes that are available. But then I think a lot of the students aren't really prepared for like the theoretical work that's going to be going into viewing and discussing these projects, mostly because, I mean, as a filmmaker who's primarily interested in experimental filmmaking, I inevitably kind of guide the class. The trajectory of the class is from more representational narrative-driven work into a more abstract domain by the end of the class. And so I think for many students, there's something to grab onto at the beginning, but then it can become a bit more challenging as we get towards like Godard and Ken Jacobs and other recent experimental films that I show. But yeah, I try to build up a kind of sense of history and the history of the medium and how and why, talking about why it's been a format that comes and goes. And in a sense, I don't think it would be all that different from a class like if I were teaching a class on color cinema and the history of Technicolor, for example. Like it's just a different visual format that we're talking about. Instead of starting with The Wizard of Oz, I start with Dial M for Murder and work my way basically through Avatar and Gravity and Goodbye to Language up to the present.
What about the format? Or I guess a better way to phrase it. What about your new film begged to have this format utilized? Like, I got a sense of what the movie is about, but I think you probably will do a better job of explaining it than I could. So, what about it? Seemed so perfect to use 3D to kind of create it.
Well, a lot of the project is the project is based off of another way of saying it is the film begins by looking at this event that occurred in Galveston, Texas, in the year 1900. Galveston being a coastal port town about an hour outside of Houston, which is where I'm from. And in 1900, there was a hurricane that hit the coast, and this was a couple of years before radio and like meteorological telegraphy was kind of enforced as a standard, and so like weather reports of coming major storms were very slow to reach the coast and to warn people. And so this event kind of happened at this perfect moment where Galveston was booming, and it was actually the most populated city in Texas at that time. But technology just wasn't quite there in order to protect them from the storm that was coming, and that hurricane ended up killing approximately a third of the entire city, and which ultimately kind of moved the cultural center from Galveston into Houston, which is now the most populated city in Texas, of course. And so I was thinking a lot about this fact of technology and the turn of technology that this storm just kind of narrowly missed, and technology as a kind of protective force in that sense, like something that actually is their sense of safety for a population and for people, and just kind of considering this question in the context of 3D and image making in general, because 1900 hesitation of being at this moment of the birth of cinema, this moment when cinema was starting to become popular, but before it was kind of settled down into a narrative mode, and people were still kind of figuring out the language of what cinema really is and who is interested in it and who is it for, and like what is the audience for this. And so it was just kind of a way of thinking back at this historical moment and kind of reimagining it as happening under a different technological circumstance. And so the movie begins with stereo 3D images that were actually taken of Galveston in the aftermath of the hurricane. And so it's looking at these images of the devastation, which were photographed in 3D, as was popular at that time in news reporting. And then it shifts gears to look at a house that's somewhere nearby, apparently, but not in any specific location. And in this kind of warehouse near this house, there's this development of this prototype of a new televisual object that shows 3D images of something. It's not clear what, and it's not clear why, but most of the movie is looking at this, allowing you as a viewer of the film to have this kind of active investigation of what this object is showing and why, wondering why it's showing it, and just trying to figure it out as something that's not really being presented with any specific context. So it is an object that is, in a way, very pure and absolute, because it doesn't have any language that we can kind of attach to it. And so I was kind of drawn to this idea of looking at an object that's imagined and make-believe, but it also kind of resembles something that we can say is somewhat familiar, but familiar in perhaps an uncanny way. And so, yeah, that's kind of what the movie is. And I kind of made it not really fully aware of whether or not it was even a movie, but I was happy that after it showed at a couple of film festivals, people were starting to write about it in a way that was calling it a movie. And so I was like, okay, I guess this is actually a movie. All right, so.
Do you have any footage of contemporary Galveston in there, or is it all this archival footage?
There is a bit, yeah. In the last several months of filming, and I filmed on and off for about 2 years, I went back to Galveston during one of my visits home and like shot around some of the hurricane memorials that they have on the coastline. And those do make an impact.
Did you get the seawall and all that too?
Yeah. And there's still some like memorabilia rubble that they have just kind of there, which is also there. But I think if you aren't familiar with those monuments, then I don't think it would necessarily be clear to you what you're looking at, like the idea that you're looking at this memorial for that event.
One of the things I was kind of curious is like how contemporary Galveston, how you feel like it works on film, because I visited there because I have family, so I visited there a little bit. And my impression of the city was always that it felt like an old city, not like ancient like a European one, but like a city kind of like frozen in time. So there's a lot of architecture and houses that feel very like early 20th century, like, and maybe this is just like myself like understanding like or hearing about the 1900 hurricane, but in a lot of ways it feels like that city kind of froze in time at that moment with the hurricane. I wonder if you found that like beyond like memorials or whatever, was there anything about like contemporary Galveston that maybe resonated with like using these kind of maybe in this kind of older mode of filmmaking where you're kind of like, inventing the film language, in this same way that, filmmakers around like that Galveston storm were kind of inventing film language. I wondered if there was any sort of resonance with the city for yourself.
Maybe. I mean, it's the second film that I've shot in Galveston. And funny enough, the other one, which I shot in 2008, but this was not a 3D film, I shot just after Hurricane Ike hit Galveston.
Yeah.
And so there's always this kind of, the thing that always brings me to Galveston is the hurricane and the devastation of something.
So every few years.
Yeah. And I guess when I shot that one, I shot way more of the actual city because there was a lot more, obviously, since that was dealing with a fresh hurricane as opposed to one that happened 117 years ago. There's a lot was actually still there, and I think it's part of the touristic draw to the area, and the charm of it is that it has this old timiness still. But I don't know if there's enough of the film of the city itself as influencing the movie that I made, that I would be able to say that there's a kind of like an analog or a parallel between the conversation with technology that I'm having with with a conversation about the city as a kind of frozen in time thing, as you're saying. But I mean, I'm sure that if Galveston had become a very modernized city, that I would be less drawn to going back there and filming it. I think there is something about the fact that it is so unusual with relation to how cities look now that is appealing. But yeah, I mean, pretty much all the footage that I got of Galveston for this film is basically looking out at the water anyway, so you don't really see any of the architecture in this one.
While we are having conversations about technology and inventing new film languages and stuff, this might be irrelevant, but I feel compelled to ask, as an academic who studies 3D as a new mode of visual storytelling, do you have any just general thoughts about VR and like whether or not that has the same kind of future that 3D ended up having? Is it even cinema because it doesn't have a frame? What do you see as the future of VR and how it relates to movies as we know them now?
My stock answer to this question has been that well, first of all, I haven't really experienced VR outside of 2 Christmases ago when my uncle got some sort of like Gear VR headset thing for his Samsung phone, and I tested it out for like 10 minutes, and it seemed cool enough. And I have nothing against VR, but the thing about VR is I don't. To answer your question of is it cinema, is I don't really think it is. Like, I think of it more in line with gaming, and gaming is great. Like, I have nothing against gaming. I just think it's a different medium than cinema. Like, the thing about cinema is, in addition to the fact that it's I value one of the things I value about cinema is the kind of communal experience that you can have with it, and you can go to a movie and sit with an audience. As annoying as audiences often are, like, there is a certain energy I find that you have with watching a film with other people, and everyone seeing and hearing the exact same thing at the exact same time. Right. And that I think your own subjective response to that becomes more telling about who you are, because you can, compare that to how other people are reacting to this, as opposed to everyone having their own unique experience where, some people are looking left and others are looking right, or some people are, jumping up and down for 10 minutes and other people are just kind of walking off and doing whatever their own thing is. And yeah, it's the fact that you have a fixed duration, you have a fixed spatial component where the frame is always the same for everybody in a movie, whereas in VR the frame is not always the same, and it's just this kind of absolute thing that cinema is, and as an experience that I think is kind of fundamental to what makes cinema. And so VR is something that I think is it's still very novel, and I don't know really what it's going to do, but I do feel fairly confident that it will not be the future of cinema that some people perhaps think or even fear that it might be currently. I think it's just too fundamentally different thing to ever be a kind of replacement for that.
I laughed when you talked about the communal experience of watching movies and your reaction being different than the people around you, because I'm thinking about 2 weeks from now watching Jackass 3D with a crowd of people, and just how incredible or just strange of an experience that is going to be to watch people react to this movie. We've mostly talked about that film kind of to bring it back around to Jackass in very theoretical academic terms, but if you don't mind, I'm kind of curious what your opinion of the movie is, just as a movie, as a piece of entertainment. What are your general thoughts on Jackass in general, or Jackass 3D specifically?
Well, I've only seen it twice, and it was basically the 2 times that I've taught it, and I found it way funnier actually the second time. The first time, the only part that I really actually found funny was the opening with Beavis and Butthead, actually, kind of, demonstrating, just kind of making fun of the myth of 3D as giving you a more tactile experience, that it literally slaps you in the face. I was also distracted by the certain moments of like the camera kind of being an intrusion to a certain like candidness that certain stunts are going for. Like there's a moment where a couple of little people are having like a domestic dispute in a bar, and then all of a sudden it gets very rowdy and people get hurt, and then like a bunch of little people, paramedics and police officers show up, and you have all these innocent bystanders who are just kind of there witnessing all of this and being befuddled by the fact that all these little people have shown up and caused this huge scene and this huge ruckus in this bar in the middle of the afternoon. Yeah, it's like a moment that's not really doing anything with the 3D in any way, but it's also like the fact that there are cameras present, like ruins any sense that this is in any way a surprise or feels like in something that's like unstaged. And so things like that I always find sort of surprising, just because one of the things about that I think would make something like that really work and make it kind of unique to the Jackass experience is this kind of sense that it's kind of real and that it's unexpected and genuinely surprising. And I don't know, like it's been a long time since I've watched the first two Jackass films, but like I feel like there's more kind of things like that in this one than I remember in the series when I first watched it, when it was like airing on MTV, and then when I watched the first two movies. But watching it the second time, I didn't really have those problems with it. Like I found most of it actually really funny, and you know I don't, and also the moments that kind of nauseated me were even somehow more effective. Maybe it's just the fact that I didn't have to compete against my expectations about what I wanted from a 3D Jackass movie anymore, but like everything seemed funnier, everything seemed more disgusting, everything seemed more nauseating, and it kind of had the experience that I was kind of hoping it to have the second time I saw it. And so yeah, and I mean I really don't need anything more from a Jackass movie than to feel like I need to throw up and to laugh a bunch of times. And so in that sense, like it's kind of, for what it is, it's like, you know, in a way kind of perfect.
Well, Blake, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us.
Sure, no problem.
And I encourage people in the Knoxville or Tennessee area to go to the Big Ears Festival and check out Blake's film, as well as the other 3D films that they'll be playing there. I'm very jealous that you all are going to get to see all those. It sounds really cool.
It'll be a good time, yeah.
And that will wrap up this episode of Cinematary, this very long episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at @Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we post all of the movies, specifically the Jackass ones that we talked about in this episode. Next week, we will be doing a double feature with two true Tennessee icons. I think these are kind of two of the faces that you most closely associate with the state of Tennessee, and that is Elvis Presley and Dolly Parton. So we will be doing 1957's Jailhouse Rock and 1980's 9 to 5. So yeah, it should be a fun one, and it's kind of one of those, if you're going to do a series on Tennessee movies or just Tennessee in general, you can't leave out Elvis and Dolly. So until then, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.